Hello and welcome. My name is Carol Carter, and we're delighted that you're joining us for celebrating our 2020 graduates this week with Global Minded Virtual. And we are thrilled to have so many wonderful people this week who are making time to support our 2020 graduates, who are courageous and deserve to really be honored when they're established rituals are not able to happen this year, but what we're finding is there are a lot of other gifts in the people like Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler, we're going to hear from in a few minutes, who are stepping up to really support these tremendous graduates, and we call them, in Crystal Rose's terms, our national treasures. And so we are going to hear from Nita today. We've had a series of different what we call graduation speeches. And tomorrow we'll hear from Rocio Perez, who's Global Minded's Director of Leadership, runs the First Generation to College program at Global Minded. And then on Friday, we have a Lunch and Learn, an industry marketplace lunch and learn with a number of different people from the construction fields with Dr. Plashan McCune. And then we have something very special in the afternoon, which is a graduation ceremony and a party with several different college presidents who are all people of color, and a singer for graduation ceremony. And you don't have to be first gen or even graduating to attend, but if you are interested in supporting and being there to help this year's grads, we'd love to invite you to join us for that on Friday afternoon. So today's session is called the Graduation Celebration, Crisis Produces Inner Strength for Lifelong Success. And Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler is a really perfect person to be giving this particular topic because she has been a trailblazer in so many different ways. She is the former Senior Vice President and Chief Inclusion Officer for Children's Hospital, Colorado, and she was the first African-American woman to hold that position in that organization's 100-year history. She's also a PhD. She is also the founder of the Equity Project, and she's got another organization called the HR Shop that helps people who are small businesses perform all of their different HR functions. So we're delighted to welcome Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler today. She's been part of our leadership team, and we've been really blessed to be able to work with her the last few years. So you're in for a treat. Thank you for joining us today. And we'll tell you some more at the end of Nita's talk. Thanks. Welcome, Nita.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you to the Global Minded team. I'm going to wish a big congratulations to our graduates, even those entering college. I'm so proud of the work that everybody is doing, and quite the difficult time in history to be doing it. So I have the privilege of spending a little bit of time with you on a topic that is a very timely one, and that is to talk about having inner strength, having excellence, and even having resiliency for lifelong success while we're in the middle of a crisis. It is a complicated time in history. I know that you all know that, but there's something about working and operating and learning in times that might be considered dark to focus on how we might be the creators of the light. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, the many different ways that you might see some good in a time that might not be great. I have an interesting story to get us started with this. Carol introduced me and she shared with you a little bit of my background, but I want to just focus on a part of that background with you. And it was the last job that I had before I started my own business. In 2016, this was the year of the presidential election too, there I was sitting in a fantastic organization, Children's Hospital, Colorado. It is a great organization, and it was a great role for me. I was the head of HR and the chief inclusion officer, and in many ways, I felt like I had achieved my professional goals. There I was sitting in the executive suite. And then the presidential election happened. And when it happened, I started to see some things that maybe some of you saw. I saw that we were beginning to polarize. We meaning the country, the communities, and sometimes even the workplace. We were polarizing around our ability to talk about difficult things. One of those difficult things was race, but anything that had to do with diversity, inclusion, or equity became a little bit more challenging to talk about. It made me nervous that we were losing our ability to talk about things that should matter to all of us. And as a matter of fact, I have to be honest with you, I feel like I couldn't sleep at night. I couldn't sleep at night around that issue because my story is I grew up in the segregated South. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, through the Jim Crow era, and I remember some of the worst times in our history. I remember drinking from a colored water fountain. I remember going to places and there were Negroes not allowed signs because Black people weren't allowed to go to restaurants or stores or some of the things that most of us take for granted. And then even when I went off to college, the Klan was burning crosses there because they didn't want Black students on campus. All of those things happened in my past, and what I started experiencing in 2016 reminded me of some of the elements of that. And I'm sharing that story with you because that too was a dark time. I knew I needed to find light in a time that was feeling dark for me. And so here's the light. The light is I made likely the biggest decision I've ever made in my entire life. And that was to leave the organization that I worked up to my whole career, the kind of job, the kind of place, the kind of role, to start something that was going to be a bit of an unknown. And that unknown for me was called the Equity Project. It's an organization that I started that helps other organizations figure out their strategies for doing diversity, inclusion, and equity work. So it's a story that's really important for you to know because it'll give you context for a lot of the things that I'll share with you over the next few minutes, like this. It's my favorite slide. It's my favorite slide because it says a whole lot in a picture, and I wanted to share it with you. And the reason it's my first slide is it's something that I want you to think about throughout my presentation with you. I know that each one of you has heard, we're all in the same boat. We've all heard it. And sometimes when we hear it, we just roll our eyes. But I wanted to show you a picture of the actual boat. We really are all in one boat, but there is something very different that occurs depending on where you sit in the boat. So I want you to have a consciousness of that where you sit isn't the only place in the boat, and that it's incumbent upon us to be excellent and to be successful, that we always keep in mind where people are sitting on the boat, including yourself. So I wanted to share that with you just as context for what we'll be talking about. Another thing that I want you to be thinking about as you think about success, as you think about excellence, is I do want you to think about some factors that are at play during a crisis. The boat analogy helps a little bit, but there's a phenomena that I want you to know a little bit about too. It's called diversity fatigue. Now, I should ask if anybody knows what diversity fatigue means. Has anybody ever heard of diversity fatigue? I'm seeing some people nod their heads. Go ahead. Do I hear someone that wants to share? Okay. Diversity fatigue is exactly what it says. It is a fatigue about the topic of diversity. Now, that sounds really strange, but it's a real phenomenon. It really means that you're just sick and tired of talking about diversity or things related to diversity. And I want you to know it's real. Not only is it real, it doesn't discriminate. We can all have diversity fatigue. It really just depends on what's going on. I can have diversity fatigue. You can have diversity fatigue. It just depends. So diversity fatigue is this feeling that I can't talk about this anymore, that we've already talked about this, that we've been talking about this for 20 years. And I want you to know that it's important for you to know what it means and how it impacts us. So diversity fatigue is like this. It's always rooted in something. So I want you to just pause for a minute and think about what your own diversity fatigue might be rooted in. Now, I told you my story as we got started about growing up in the segregated South and some of the things and times that I lived through. Well, that is the root of my diversity fatigue. Growing up during a time of segregation and discrimination and those kinds of things, that's the root of what tires me on this topic. Now, I want you to think about what your root is. That's the first thing I want you to think about. The second thing I want you to think about beyond the root of your diversity fatigue is I want you to start thinking about what triggers your diversity fatigue. Because here's the deal. You don't just wake up in the morning and say, oh, it's a great day, I've got diversity fatigue. It doesn't work like that. How it works is something usually triggers it in you. So I'll just share examples of me. I won't put you on the spot, but let me just share an example of what a trigger might look like. I am triggered anytime anybody begins to describe how they're discriminated against. Now, I'm not saying it's right because triggers aren't right, they're just triggers. But whenever someone decides to describe how they're discriminated against, I start comparing in my head what they just said to what happened to me. So if what they just said doesn't sound like drinking from a colored water fountain or seeing Negroes Not Allowed signs or having a cross burning on your college campus, I'm triggered. That's how triggers work. They're not right, they're just triggers. So I want you to pause a minute and think about the kinds of things that trigger you in your diversity fatigue. What are those things? Whether they're right or wrong, what are they? Why do I want you to know about your triggers? I want you to know about your triggers because when you get triggered in your diversity fatigue, your body starts doing some really strange things. There's a reaction in your body when you're triggered. So I've studied my diversity fatigue enough and my triggers enough that I now know what my body does when I'm triggered. So I know now when I'm triggered that I do some major eye rolling. I know I'm doing some major eye rolling. I can feel it. I also know that my breathing changes, that I take deeper sighs when I'm triggered. And then I also do this weird thing on the side of my face like this, where I just am scratching the side of my face. You can see the nail marks on the side. That happens to me when I'm triggered. So I want you to start to pay attention to what happens to you when you get triggered in your diversity fatigue. And the reason I want you to do that is because when you were triggered and your body starts doing its thing, somebody is looking at you. And when they're looking at you, they're making a decision about what your body language is saying, whether you meant it or not. So tackling this diversity fatigue and what our triggers are and what our body is doing when we're triggered is a very important part of what we need to pay attention to, particularly during times of crisis, because that's when diversity fatigue gets triggered most often. So here's your pause point. I call it a pause point. I just want you to think about this for a minute. I want you to start to think about how you're seeing diversity fatigue show up at work, at school, in your house, in the community, those you serve. All the people that you have interactions with, I want you to start to think about how you're actually seeing diversity fatigue show up. In a time of crisis where you see a lot of this happening, it's important for us to pause long enough to name it, to call it what it is, and to have some grace around what people are trying to tackle. That's what diversity fatigue is. So keep exploring that one too. Now, you heard me a little earlier talk about some of the words that are on this slide, and I just included this one because I also think this is an important thing for all of us to be thinking about, particularly during a difficult time like the time that we're in today. I want you to think about this as a spectrum. In a crisis, you will see a couple of things happen, and you probably already have. You will see where we've got some disparities, that some things just aren't fair or equal or equitable, that some people aren't included. And then on the flip side of that, you might see opportunities to increase diversity, expand diversity, ways to involve more people, and even ways to create systems of equity. The reason I want you to focus on these 4 words is because this is where we've got so much opportunity in our country during this time. You know, when I think about global minded, I think about all 4 of these words. I think about looking around at all of the people that are involved with global minded. What a beautiful reflection of what diversity really is. All kinds of diversity. Even beyond race and ethnicity, there's so many different types of diversity reflected in the global minded system. And then there's that word inclusion, that word that reminds us that it's not good enough to just be diverse. If people don't feel like they belong, then you're not really inclusive. So creating systems and spaces and opportunities where we can all feel like we're a part of something and that we belong, almost like this graduation ceremony. That's what inclusion's all about. And then there's equality, which means things are equal. People have access to the same things. We're not leaving people out, is where we focus on when we talk about equality. And then there's equity. I call equity my North Star. This is what my dream is. This is what I want young people all over the world to be focused on. This is the legacy you're going to leave. And that is creating a system of equity, a system where every single person has what they need to thrive in the world. I want you to keep these words front of mind too, as we work through this crisis in particular. Keep your eyes on where you might see opportunities to do great things. It might inform what you want to study. It might inform what you want to change or to fix or to strengthen. It might inform what you want to do more of, and it might inform what you might want to do less of. But I wanted to share this with you to let you know that not just one of these words is important, but all of these words is important, and you are reflected in every single one of them. And then there's this, my friends. In a crisis, there's this nasty little thing that can sneak up on us. And I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's something called the imposter syndrome. The imposter syndrome works like this. It's this little thing that whispers in your ear that tells you that you're not good enough. You're not smart enough. You're not rich enough. You're not fill in the blank enough. And so the first side of this diagram shows you exactly what I said. It is you thinking that everybody knows a lot more than you do. That's what the imposter syndrome does for us. It shows up when we have a lot of diversity fatigue. It shows up when we're afraid. It shows up when people don't support us and when we don't have systems of support. That's what lets imposter syndrome in. So the reality is, the right side of this slide is the reality. You are not smaller than anyone else. Other people know things and you know things, and those things are equal. And so the challenge for us is to acknowledge when we are beginning to feel, sense, and see imposter syndrome in ourselves and in others. You know, one thing I can tell you about the Global Minded team is they are very good at identifying when the imposter syndrome is present in the rest of us. And that support system that they've created to make sure that we can get imposter syndrome out of the way is really valuable in our world. Your role in that is to figure out how to manage that in your personal life. I am still a work in progress there too. Sure, I've got a PhD, I've got 2 companies, I've had great jobs. Still, there are times when I get imposter syndrome, when I think that somehow I'm not good enough or smart enough or the best person for the job. It just happens to all of us. So it is a work in progress for us. This slide says it too, especially when you start thinking about jobs and employment. Imposter syndrome would have you to believe that everybody is more qualified for the jobs, and then there's little bitty you. Well, we know that isn't true, but we do know imposter syndrome would have you to believe that's true. So there are all kinds of ways to tackle imposter syndrome. One, you just have to know what it is, but when it begins to happen to you, when you start to feel inferior, I want you to pause for a minute and remember what I just shared with you. I want you to give it a name. When it happens to you, I want you to call it imposter syndrome. And then I want you to go a step further. I've actually given my imposter a name. Her name is Genevieve. I hope nobody on the call is named Genevieve. If it is, I love you, Genevieve, but my imposter is called Genevieve. I gave her a name because when I start to feel inferior and I start to feel that imposter coming, I need to call her by name. So when it happens to me, I go, Genevieve, and I flick her off. And I literally do it that way. And I have found that actually helps to keep me strong. It actually helps me to fight what the imposter syndrome actually does. So if you don't remember anything else about our time together today, I want you to remember that. Your imposter ought to have a name. So name your imposter, then shrug it off. Important for us to think about. Now I want to share something that's super old with you. This is super old because it's a picture of me a long, long time ago. I was 7 years old in this picture. That was like 100 years ago. And if you look closely, you can tell I wasn't very happy in this picture. Among other things, I don't think I combed my hair either, but that's not the point. The point really is I wasn't very happy. If you'll also look closely, you'll notice that I've got my hand on the doorknob. Well, my hand is on the doorknob because I'm leaving. I'm leaving home. I'm running away from home. I'm running away from home because I was sick and tired of the civil rights movement. That's how old this picture is. So I told my parents, hey, I don't understand the civil rights movement. All these bad things are happening. You adults have screwed up the whole place. Now you don't know how to fix it. So my dad looked at me and he gave me this really educated answer. Made no sense. And then my mom looked at me and she just shrugged her shoulders because she didn't know what to say. My dad said it's just complicated. None of that worked for me. So I decided the best thing to do would be for me to forget what the adults were doing and to go fix it myself. So this is a picture of me running away from home to go fix the civil rights movement. Except right when I got ready to turn the doorknob, my dad said, hey, wait a minute before you leave. Got to go get my camera. I want to take a picture of you before you leave so I can remember what you looked like. And there you have it. That's the picture. So there's something that happened in that moment that was very important that I still hold today, and it's what I want to share with you. And that is, I learned a little bit about the power of pausing. And when you think about the time that we're in right now, it is an absolutely important time in history for us to learn how to pause. You see, one of the things that is required today for us to get to those systems of equity that I mentioned a minute ago, for us to tackle our diversity fatigue, for us to really think about what's going on in that boat, we have to pause. Our lives are busy. We're busy with school and work and family and activities. We're almost robotic in the way that we do things because we're just busy. But when you're that busy, you don't have time to be thoughtful or to innovate or to create great ideas and new strategies. It isn't possible without a pause. That moment when I was 7 years old taught me all about what power a pause can have in your life. Were it not for the fact that my father paused what I was about to do, I would have probably made a very big mistake walking out of that door. But because he inserted a pause for me, my life changed around how I thought about the complexities of the civil rights movement, what I thought about what was really possible and what wasn't possible. All of those things happened in that pause. So your charge, your accountability in the world today needs to include some pause in it. Now, some pauses take years. Other pauses take minutes. It doesn't really matter. All I'm asking you to do is to think about ways and places and times that you can insert a pause in what you're doing. Before you say the next thing, before you hit send on your email, before you get involved in something, think about a way to insert a pause in that. So here's the pause instructions for you. I want you to discuss with someone at any time, explore a time when you've been successful because you inserted the power of the pause in what you're doing. Just want you to explore that. Times that I've been successful because I paused. And then I want you to think about times when you've struggled. Things did not go well because you did not insert the power of the pause in what you were doing. And lastly, the thing to think about here is, what will it take collectively for all of us to institutionalize, to build this practice of pausing in what we do every day? When you go to school, is there a way to build a pause in? When you go to work, is there a way to build a pause in so you can think it through and be thoughtful? In your families, is there a way to build a pause in what you're doing? So I want you to think about those three things. They are key ingredients to having all of the rest of the things that I've talked about work. If being robotic is what you're doing right now, I want you to think about what opportunities we have if we slow down long enough to think it through. What if the thing that we're doing today isn't the key to success? But if we took an hour this week to just rethink some things that we're doing, could we change the direction of so many things in the world? So power of the pause, really important in this. And then there's this. This is one of my favorite old movies, Rush Hour. And this movie came out way before a lot of you were even born. And this is a classic scene in the movie. It's a scene filled with all kinds of stereotypes and microaggressions in it. And it's where Chris Tucker says, "Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? to a person that absolutely understood the words that were coming out of his mouth, we have to understand the words that are coming out of our own mouths. What an interesting time about language, our mouths, power, and all of the impacts that that has on one another. So one of the things I also want you to be thinking about is what is coming out of your mouth during a time like this? And is what's coming out of your mouth inspirational, or does it antagonize or harm? It is widely known that very good people in the world under crisis can sometimes say and do really bad things. Crisis does that to us. But if I go backwards a little bit, the imposter syndrome will do that to us too. Sometimes when we feel less than, what comes out of our mouth is what gives us an attempt to have more power in the world. When we feel powerless, sometimes what we say isn't as controlled. So I want you to focus on this. This is a great power in the pause moment. I want you to focus on what your language and behavior has been in crisis versus what it was before we were in crisis. Anytime you're upset, what is your language then versus when you're not upset? This is an important element in advancing equity, also advancing excellence in what we're doing, is to have some idea of the impact of what we say and what we do to others during a crisis. And the best way to look at that is to look at it in terms of power. I talk about power all the time. I like to talk about power because when I think about things like imposter syndrome and diversity fatigue and even equity, one of the things that gets in the way of all of those things is when we feel like we don't have power. So I want to talk about that for a minute. I want to talk about power. I want you to walk away today understanding power maybe differently than you did when we got started. So this slide is something that's called the 5 Bases of Social Power. It's a very old model. It came out in the 1950s, but I think it has everything to do with what we're doing today. And so I wanted to share it with you. So here's how it works, and I'll explain how it shows up in our behavior. It starts with this number 1 power base. It says legitimate power. So legitimate power is power that is based on our titles, our positions, or our rank. That's all it means. It just means you've got power because of the position that you have. So we know that people have position power. If you've got some kind of title, even if your parents even, they have titles. Mom, dad, aunt, uncle, grandma. Those are titles. Legitimate power. Those are titles inside of organizations. Those are titles inside of schools. That just means there are people that have position power. Then there's the second one. It's called expert power. Now I want you to listen carefully about this one. This one says you get your power from your skills, your abilities, and your knowledge. You don't have to have a title for this one. It just says you've got knowledge power. So the best story I can tell you about this one is a few years before I was at Children's Hospital, I was the head of HR for the city and county of Denver. And there was a woman in our housekeeping staff. Her name was Graciela. Now, Graciela spoke very little English. And every evening at 6 p.m., she'd come to my office and she'd hand me a little slip of paper. And on that little slip of paper was a leadership tip. And she wanted me to use that leadership tip the next day. And she did that every single evening the entire time I worked for city government. In my mind, that is expert power. So I started using the word expert with Graciela. And every time I'd say, Graciela, you've got so much expert power, she would say, no. And she'd show me her broom and her mop to let me know that she had no power. And it was in that moment that I realized we need to talk about power a lot more. Graciela, the woman who had so much expertise, didn't see that she had expertise because she didn't know that was called power. She thought only people with titles and position had power. What an opportunity to teach people about their own power. So I want you to know that your expertise, even the expertise that you have in your own lived experiences, is expert power. It is power, and you should call it that. The third one is something that's called referent power. Referent power is the power of mutual respect. I respect you, you respect me back, therefore I have referent power. And I know many of you have referent power. And then there's reward power. Reward power is the power to give and take away rewards. Whatever those rewards are, you've got the power to give them and take them away. I know that some of the folks listening are parents, so you know about reward power. Some of you have pets, and you know about the giving and taking away of rewards. And then that last power base is coercive power. It is called the power that you get from your ability to punish other people. That's what coercive power is. So here's what I want you to know about these. We use all of them. It just depends on what we're doing. But what I want you to walk away with is normally when we use power, it comes in pairs. 2 at a time we use these things. So I want you to walk away with this. Number 1 power base in the world, regardless of what you're talking about, is number 1 and number 5. Legitimate coercive power is the number 1 power base combination in the world, meaning we use that one more than any other. I want you to sit with that for a minute. That is how most of our world was built, on a foundation of legitimate coercive power, people's titles and their ability to punish one way or the other. Now I want you to think about the world that you want to create. If you think about the world that you want to create, the kinds of things that you want to see in the world, I want you to think about what power-based combination of 2 might get you there in a better way. A way that values inclusiveness and diversity and equity and all the things we've talked about. Well, the answer is not 1 and 5. So if you pick that, it's not that. The answer would be 2 and 3. It is expert referent power that gives us the best opportunity to create those kinds of systems that we want in the world, where you can lead and lead inclusively. It's expert referent power. So if you want a framework for how to do this work, how to get us to a better world, how to take that torch and keep going with it so that we have a beautiful legacy in our world, I want you to think about what power bases you're operating from. What power bases can you change? What power base do you like? What power base can you work on? And think about what it will take in your life to get you to expert referent power as the ideal power base for you to be using. I'll leave you with that. And one more thing about power. Start calling things power. When my kids were young and they did something really well in school, or they just did something really well, I called it power. I said, you did a great job with your expert power. That's expert power. I called it power. So they'd know that that expertise was power. And when they did something that wasn't great, I called it coercive power. I called it coercive power. I called it exactly what it was. I want you to do the same thing, because the more we can use the language, remember the words that are coming out of our mouths, I want you to use the language that reflects what we're actually talking about. And in this case, it's power. And not all power is bad. You can see from this framework that there's a lot of great power. We just need to call it that. So I'll take you to this slide as we get closer to me wrapping up. This slide's real funny too. Well, it might not be funny to you, but it's real funny to me because the picture is funny. I was at a conference, honestly. I was at a conference talking to that lady, and all of a sudden an ass walked up, and it just stood there. And it had on a hat, and the hat matched my dress, and somebody took a picture of it. I have no idea where it came from, but I don't know what else to do with the picture except to share it with the world. So there you go. Now, let me shift your attention. The picture's not what the slide is about. Honestly, it's the words. It's something I want you to remember about leadership. It's the 20-60-20 rule, and you'll hear about the 20-60-20 rule in all kinds of ways. But I like to think about the 20-60-20 rule as you're thinking about all the things I've shared with you, like how to advance equity and how do we make sure that people feel belongingness and those kinds of things. Here's what the 20-60-20 rule says. It says that 20% of the people are always going to love you. You can screw up, you can fall down, you can get back up, you can maybe say the wrong thing. They're going to be with you. They're going to love you and support you and cheer you on. 20% of all the people will do that for you. Global Minded's one of those, by the way. 60% of the people are probably going to stay quiet. They're not against you. They're just tentative. They're on the sidelines. They might not know how to engage with you. When you start saying things like equity or imposter syndrome, when you start talking about power, they're not against what you're saying. They just might not understand it or how to be in relationship with you around that. So sometimes that 60% of the people are just on the side waiting for you to engage them in some way. And then there's 20%, the 20% where it says nope. 20% of the people are never going to be with you. They're never going to understand what you're talking about. They're not going to be interested in what you're talking about. They may not engage with you at all. Now that sounds like really bad news, but it isn't. It's really great news because the great news is I've just given you a way to think about how to prioritize your life. Where are you spending your time? If you're always spending your time at the 20% that says nope, people that can't engage with you for their own reasons, it's not about you, it's about them. If that's where you're spending all of your time, I want to share with you that you've got a big opportunity in front of you. You actually have an 80% opportunity. The 20% that already love you and the 60% you're not engaging. Imagine what the world would be like if we spent more time on that 80%, cultivating that 80%. Understanding and going into relationship and proximity to that 80%, nurturing that 80%. Imagine what the world would be like if we focus there instead of on the 20% that won't be changed or moved. So I invite you to think about that. Where do you spend your time? And why are you doing that? And where's your opportunity? And begin to name what that actually looks like in your life. It's a great equation to be thinking about. Well, of course, I have opinions. You know that already. And this is one of them. I really do believe the goal in all of this, all of these things I've talked about, is not about you being perfect. It's about you being excellent. And so the other thing I want to have you do is just shift your perspective about these words, perfection and excellence. The goal really is excellence. Excellence is great, yet what it really means is it still gives you some room to make mistakes, to fall down, to get back up. It just gives you room for all of that. So I want you to hold yourself to something that is reasonable, something that is achievable, and oftentimes perfection doesn't do that for us. Perfection also leaves space sometimes for us to have imposter syndrome too. So I wanted you to know that. I'm gonna look real quickly at the chat room. There's some things, some conversations that are going on in the chat room, and lots of things that are validating the things that I'm saying right now around power and perfection and those kinds of things. So thank you for sharing those comments, and we're going to get at some of those as well. I want you to remember this too. All of us, no matter who we are in some way developing as leaders. If you are a child, you're developing as a leader. If you already have a management title, you're developing as a leader. So wherever you are in that spectrum of development as a leader, it's important to realize it's not that black and white. There's no checklist out there for what makes the perfect leader. And so this image just reminds us that we have to create a world that doesn't force fit us into things that don't work for us. And you can see in this image that this poor little, what do you call those things, sporks? This poor little spork doesn't know what door to enter. We don't want to create a world like that where we don't know what door to enter. We want to create a world where you can enter any door you want to. And so just keep in the back of your mind this imagery that we need to give people ways to thrive in whatever door they might enter. And then I'm going to end with this picture, and then we can chat some. It's another one of those really old pictures, and my brother can't stand this picture. He'd be horrified to see that I'm showing it to people in a Zoom session. So that's me again. And in this picture, I'm 8 years old, and I am feeling really great about myself. And then right next to me is my little brother, who is not feeling really great about myself. And then in the background, if you can see, it's my dad, who's not paying attention to either one of us. And the reason I like to share this picture is I think it just shows you how this work can sometimes work. I call it the triangle. There are going to be times in the world where you think what you just did was fantastic. And right next to you in the same uniform, because that's your team member or your family member, is a person that thinks what you did was not wonderful at all. And then in the background is the person that's supposed to be in charge of all of it, who isn't even paying attention. That's how the triangle works. Well, the reason I wanted to share this one with you is oftentimes we want to feel validated out of our triangle. You want your team member, your classmate, your family member to be on board with you. And the person that's supposed to be in charge of things, you want them to be on board. But here's the deal. Sometimes they're not. They're not bad people. They're not aligned with what you're doing. So I don't want you to get discouraged about that. I want you to feel empowered about that. And I want you to have a solution for that. I want you to have more than a triangle in your life. I want you to be anchored in different places so that you can be affirmed for what you're doing. Somebody outside of the triangle should be available to you to cheer you on when necessary and to sit you down when necessary. You need to figure out where else you need to be anchored outside of your triangle. I learned that the hard way, so I'm telling you right now, go ahead and name where you want to be anchored. So what I know now is my anchor is my community. When my triangle doesn't necessarily work, I go for advice in the community that I live in. And I get truth. I either get affirmation or I get constructive feedback, where sometimes I won't get it out of my triangle. So remember to do that too. Remember, we all need an anchor to anchor the triangle that's present in our everyday lives. Hopefully you won't get somebody that looks like my brother's looking at me right now. By the way, my brother still looks at me that way.
It can be a brother thing.
Yeah, it could be a brother thing. So I'm going to leave you with this slide too. This is my contact information if there's anything that I can do to support you, help you, or clarify. And I think I'll just stop talking, Carol, and leave an opportunity for other people to talk if they want to.
We have a couple questions, and I'll just read them right out of the chat, Nita, and you can take them. So one of them is, I find myself meeting administrators in my university who say that they love the ideas, but it's really a that leads to a nope. That's Timothy, and then there's another question, but you can reflect on that for Timothy first.
Yeah. So Timothy, I know that one too well. It's a great idea, and we're not doing it. I have that experience all over the place. And sometimes what I have found is I have to give people, that's the triangle, I have to give people some evidence that what I'm talking about is great. And sometimes the evidence is showing what another organization or another system has done that reflects the very thing that you want to do. I think oftentimes you find out in this process how risk adverse people are. But if you can show them who else is doing it and how they're doing it and how it might align with what you're prescribing, it actually helps. It also helps to do things in bite-sized pieces. Sometimes when you say, let's do this big thing, that's one answer. But when you say, let's explore this piece, that's a different answer. So depending on the culture of the administration that you're describing, it might be that what you're prescribing is too big for them. If they're risk adverse, then you want to do smaller pieces of it.
You know, and I'll just add one other thing onto that too, Nita, is sometimes if you've got 2 or 3 other people in the power structure of the triangle and they think it's their idea or they can carry it forth as their idea, sometimes they're better messengers for your idea than you might be. And really the goal is to bring your idea to fruition. So
yeah, you know, that was one of the hardest challenges for me as I was developing my leadership skills, is learning how to lead from the rear. I mean, that isn't the way we were taught. We were taught, especially if you look at legitimate coercive power, we were taught that leadership means being in the front. But I've learned along the way that there is some power called referent power. There's some power sometimes from leading from the rear. So the mouthpiece for my idea sometimes isn't me.
Exactly. So here's another one that, let's see. Okay, wait a second. I just missed. There was one other one in here. Celeste, I think I lost one. Hold on.
Well, I've got it. Kimberly asked,
Yeah, that's Kimberly.
Yeah, how do you manage when you're operating with 2 and 3, or believe you are, but you're working with one who operates with a 4?
Yeah, I love that one. So you're operating from expert referent power, and then this person's either operating from reward power and sometimes even coercive power. So a part of this whole thing, at least in my life, is defining these power bases. So I introduce in my work very early on these power bases. I use that exact same slide and I talk about it. And then I try to get organizations to institutionalize the power bases in their work. For example, when I worked for the City and County of Denver, I institutionalized those power bases in our performance evaluations. And so I talked about, what are the attributes of coercive power? What are the attributes of reward power? So I could put them in the performance evaluation. People got rewarded for the right power bases. So some of it will take a little bit of additional work for you if you're up to doing that. I'm loving that you're operating from expert referent power, but the fact of the matter is we haven't done the other part, which is teach people about what the power bases are. And once you do that, it's a little bit easier for people to get out of denial about what power base they're actually operating from.
That's an awesome insight. And anybody else who is curious to get Nita's insights, you might, just be thinking about going out to start interviewing. Nita has a really long background with major companies in HR. And so feel free to ask these questions, because this is what's so special about a time like this, is it's really hard to get time with a person like Nita, who runs around all the time and does all these trainings, and she's just been generous to give her time to us today. So I always say, take advantage of it, because that's what's special about Global Minded. Everybody is an equal. You can be, you know, president of a foreign country and you're equal to one of our teens, you know, in tech that we bring in. So we're all equal.
That's
So,
awesome.
any other questions? If not, you can put them in the chat. You've got Nita's email, and I will say I love following Nita on Twitter because she is so courageously bold with the things that she says about equity, and I just love the way she really calls people in a really effective way, and not with a hammer,
No.
but really diplomatically. And I think that all of our young people can learn about following you on Twitter and how you can respectfully point out things that other people may not realize, and be very constructive in so doing.
Thanks for doing that, Carol. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. I'm on all of them. And the one thing I will share, I forgot to share with you a minute ago, especially for those of you that might be in the interviewing process and you're thinking about that kind of a process. One of the things that is happening that you should get prepared for is, more often than ever before, employers are asking you questions about how you've demonstrated equity and inclusion kinds of strategies. That's coming up in interviews. Like, can you give me an example of a time when you demonstrated that you are inclusive? Mm-hmm. Or can you give me some examples of times when you focused on equity? Those are actually coming up as interview questions. Mm-hmm. So if nothing else, I want you to begin to think about how in your own lives you're already doing things that are reflective of those words. It's going to be really important. And I don't want you to enter into any process with any imposter syndrome around that. So staying on top of what the current trends are with interviews and hiring, talent management kinds of activities is really important.
Awesome. Well, let's give Nita a virtual round of applause. And she's a delight. And so we are all looking forward to seeing her in person with all of you next summer in June 2021. But in the meantime, tomorrow we'll have Rocio Perez, and then we'll have our Lunch and Learn on Friday, followed by our really special graduation celebration. Many of you met Dr. Crystal Rose. She's an MD and PhD with Aussie Media, and she has just put together the most special celebration for grads with really special people to conclude the week. So thank you all for making time, and I see everyone has loved being with Nita. So Nita, thanks again so much. And Celeste and Lisa, thanks to you, and Inger, who works with Nita. And may you guys all have blessings through this crisis, and we're going to transform every difficulty. And it's going to be exactly as Nita said in this past hour. So thanks for that guidance, Nita.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
You
Wish
bet.
you the best, everybody.
Bye-bye, guys.